Welcome to this evening's virtual panel discussion, Legal and Ethical Challenges in Art Collection Stewardship. On behalf of Holocaust Museum Houston and the University of Denver, we welcome you to a dynamic and illuminating discussion led by Dr. Elizabeth Campbell, Associate Professor of History at the University of Denver. My name is Mary Lee Wiebeck, and I am the HMH Holocaust and Genocide Education Endowed Chair at the museum's Boniak Center. Before we begin tonight, I would like to share some logistical information with you. First of all, the audience's mics will be muted during tonight's presentation. Your host will be using the chat function to send you information possibly. We will be doing a Q&A section where we will be looking for questions from all of you in the audience for our panelists, and we will ask you to enter those into the Q&A box that's on the bottom of your Zoom screen instead of the chat. So the Q&A box, you should look for that right now so you have that handy. I would like to remind you, and I'll be coming back on the chat in a little bit, to remind you to put questions in there. And now I would like to do my favorite thing, and that's to introduce tonight's moderator, Dr. Elizabeth Campbell. Dr. Campbell is, as I mentioned earlier, an associate professor of history at the University of Denver. And since 2018, she has been the founder and director of the Center for Arts Collection Ethics. Her expertise in French and European history and Nazi art looting has led to the publication of 2 books. The first was published in 2011 by Stanford University Press, and the second one is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. I know I am looking forward to reading that when it comes out. Elizabeth's knowledge and eloquence on this subject leads to her frequent contributions to various media outlets, including the New York Times, the LA Times, Slate, Time, Newsweek, and the Art newspaper. As the founder and director of DU's Center for Art Collection Ethics, Dr. Campbell's dedication to developing training for current graduate students and for emerging museum professionals, highlighting the importance of provenance research and museum transparency is very central to what she does. We certainly look forward to Elizabeth's moderation this evening of a fascinating panel who bring a range of experience. So since we have begun working together on this project between the museum and University of Denver, I have been looking forward to the chance to say what I'm going to say in just a minute. And I get to say this again tonight because we said it just last week. And that is, welcome, Dr. Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Mary Lee. It has been such a pleasure to build this partnership between the University of Denver and Holocaust Museum Houston. And I have to say that, you know, we are in this, as I mentioned last week, a strange pandemic environment with some of us have virtual backgrounds. And yet we've been able to establish this really amazing connection. And, you know, especially working with you and your team, Mary Lee, I just feel like we've been able to have very meaningful discussions. And we do have that silver lining of broadening our audience. And in our Q&A from last week, I realized that I had a dear family friend from Missoula, Montana joining us, and someone commented from Australia, which was remarkable that we could bring together so many people. And I have greatly appreciated the partnership that we've been able to develop and look forward to continuing it. I think we can maintain some of the positive aspects of this virtual environment going forward. And then also really appreciate those in-person connections even more once we can see each other, truly face-to-face. So thank you so much. And also to your team, Tamara Savage and Chris Henrik, all of these folks, we did a round of thank yous last week, but they do deserve to be thanked twice because this really has been a remarkable series. And to Amelia Ribnick-Kleiman, who is a loyal DU alumna and someone who is active with various organizations in the Houston area. So Amelia is the one who had the vision of bringing us together and learned about the work being done at the Center for Art Collection Ethics at DU. Her family connections to DU are continuing with her daughter starting as an undergraduate at DU next year. So they're strengthening that connection. And as someone who's very involved with Houston institutions and museums and with Rice University, helped us build this amazing partnership. So thank you to Amelia for bringing us together. I really look forward to continuing this partnership. And mentioning Rice, thanks also to Joshua Furman of the program in Jewish Studies at Rice for his role in helping to co-sponsor last week's program. They're on break this week, but we really appreciate that co-sponsorship from last week. And in addition at DU, these events are co-sponsored by the Holocaust Awareness Institute at DU, directed by Adam Rovner with assistance by Ingrid Weher. And the whole DU team, Jennifer Garner, thanks as always for all of your hard work on this event, Laura Miller and the marketing team, and the ACE graduate assistant, our social media maven, Lauren Turner, who is really getting all of our information out on our various social media channels. So thanks to all who have really made this series possible. So for tonight's program, I am delighted to welcome this panel of experts, and each has a different role in the art world. So we're still going to be talking about the legacy of Nazi art plunder. Mary Lee had the excellent suggestion when we were first talking about organizing this event, knowing that one program was not going to be nearly enough. So we had my talk last week, which gave more of a historical perspective and mentioned some examples of ongoing restitution cases. But Mary Lee saw that it would be very helpful to have a series and to invite others who are working in the art world to give their perspectives. So we are going to have the perspectives of museum staff member and provenance researcher. That's one person in both of those roles with separate institutions, and an attorney specializing in art law, and a Houston area gallery owner with a good deal of experience with the art market. So all these practitioners bring a different perspective that I think is really going to help to keep the conversation going, knowing the historical context from last week's program. And if you weren't able to join last week, there is a recording available. So we can, if you contact us through the chains, how you got involved in tonight's event, we will make sure that you can have access to that free recording. And we're going to be expanding on some of those ideas in tonight's program. So the way it'll work is that I will give a brief introduction before each panelist speaks. They will be speaking for about 15 minutes. And then I will ask a few questions. So we'll have a discussion among the panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. As Mary Lee mentioned, you can submit your questions through the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so I'm happy to introduce our first panelist, who is Renée Albiston. She is Associate Museum Director of the Kirkland Museum of Fine and Decorative Art in Denver, and has carried out provenance research at the Denver Art Museum. In her work with the Denver Art Museum, she has mainly focused on paintings, and especially European paintings. And so this experience provide some really fascinating insight into the importance of provenance research, which I talked about quite a bit last week, and how the legacy of Nazi art plunder impacts art museums today, and the ethical responsibility of museums to carry out that research. So welcome, Renée.
Thank you. So I just want to give a quick overview of the work that I do. I work in my day job, as Elizabeth mentioned, at a museum that has both fine art and decorative art. So fine art being defined as paintings and sculpture, and decorative art, of course, is decorative objects. What makes provenance research particularly difficult in the museum that I'm at is our collection is comprised a large portion of objects. There's quite a big difference of research avenues available for objects versus fine art. One of the challenges is that there are no markings on many objects, or they were mass produced. They were part of, many objects were parts of large collections that were stolen or sold under duress without any trackable ownership, or, like I said, marking stamps or anything like that, that make it particularly challenging. So the work that I really concentrate on, as Elizabeth said, is on paintings. I do work for the Denver Art Museum in my spare time, doing research for different paintings. I've been with them for quite a few years now. And I want to show an example of kind of where I start when I start my research. Chris, if you can pull our image up. Although the front of paintings, of course, are what our audience loves to see, and they're the lovely part of the museum experience, my role really comes in looking at the back of paintings. So this is a great example of what I like to call is juicy material. This is a wonderful, this is actually the back of an Impressionist painting. So this would have been, you know, late 1800s that this canvas would have been created, and that you would start seeing dealer stamps appear on the back of paintings. You'll see all of those stamps running down the spine in the middle. And then, of course, there's other various tags and stamps around the perimeter. And that's really where I start. I start building my ownership record from looking at the oldest stamp and trying to decipher who the art dealer might have been. There's just a wealth of information back here. There are owner names a lot of times on the backs of paintings. Chris, you can take that down. That was the only image I had. But where the challenge lies is sometimes you'll see verso images that don't have any stamps, or the backs have been redone, and you sort of have to start from scratch. And that's really where the investigative work sort of begins for what I do. You know, there's an estimated 20% to 25% of Europe's art that was stolen, and it's estimated there's about 100,000 pieces left that have yet to be found. Many of those works made their way into the US through unscrupulous dealers or other means. And so I look for dealers that have been identified or red flagged during World War II as unscrupulous dealers. If I see that their involvement is in the ownership record, that's where I start diving in. Other things that are important to look for me are custom stamps coming through Switzerland or Berlin or various European countries. I've done research on works that have a ton of information in the back and still have yielded no clues for me. So then I go into, fortunately, we're in an age where so many records are digitized, and I'm able to access resources and archival information through just a wealth of different databases. A lot of art dealer records from France and from Germany are now digitized, and those are very helpful in tracking down ownership and also establishing clear title, transfer of clear title. And I think that's kind of the breadth of what I do in the provenance piece of it. And of course, you know, anybody that's very involved in this area understands the importance of transparency through collecting institutions, and having somebody on staff or contracted that can do your research for you sort of serves as somewhat of an insurance policy for paintings that might be going on loan or might be going on view. If an institution can show that they've really done their homework and done their due diligence, it helps create a little bit of breathing room, I guess. If you want to put something on view, you can feel a little more comfortable that you've at least done everything that you can do as an institution to confirm that this is not something that's been identified as a stolen painting or a stolen artwork. I think that's kind of wraps up my what I wanted to say.
Okay, excellent. It's so fascinating to have an example at the back of a frame of a painting. I showed an image last week as well, but you've given us a lot to think about. But we'll come back to talk a little bit more about some of the nuts and bolts, as well as the principles and the ethical responsibilities of provenance research. But next, let's turn to Nicholas O'Donnell. He is a partner at Sullivan and Worcester in Boston, and his clients include museums, galleries, as well as collectors. He is the author of A Tragic Fate, Law and Ethics in the Battle Over Nazi-Looted Art. I keep it right next to my desk. I don't know if this will turn out very well in the virtual, I have to maybe show it right in front of me. Here we go. You can see my Post-its from where I have noted important information. I keep it right by my desk as I am working on my own book. So A Tragic Fate was published by the American Bar Association in 2017. And Nicholas also publishes blog posts regularly in the Art Law Report, which is a useful resource for anyone interested in this area. You'll often see journalists referring to it. And he also recently appeared before the US Supreme Court in a couple art restitution cases, which I spoke about a little bit last week, and that he might provide greater insight into this week. So welcome, Nicholas.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and to all my fellow panelists. So what I want to talk about a little bit tonight is just sort of the work I do as a lawyer, which is hard to condense terribly well, but I'll do my best. And it's nice to follow what Renée had to say, because I come at this actually kind of in my initial approach to these things from a historical perspective as someone who worked in an art museum before I was a lawyer. Doing some provenance research about this very topic. And really, I think in terms of sort of the nuts and bolts of what do we know and how do we know it and what's the documentary source and where do we go from there. So I'm going to try to go through a number of concepts if I can. So I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me. About how, I mean, I'm a lawyer, I'm a disputes lawyer, about how these things shake out and how they've gone and maybe what we can look forward to in the future. So I'm gonna do this. There we go. Okay, so there's a lot of concepts at work here, but what I want to talk about is some of the things that I always keep in mind when we're talking about what's in dispute and what do we do with it. Because as a lawyer, I will tell you that the law doesn't like to make exceptions, no matter the compelling circumstances of a particular case. The law is focused on sort of normative neutral rules that apply to a variety of disputes. And disputes that are very old are things that the law does not like to deal with. In addition, the law has a lot of things baked into it about who carries the burden to prove a certain thing or not. You know, if I steal Elizabeth's car and she sues me, or she accuses me of that, she will carry the burden to convince the fact finder that I am in fact responsible for this. What's interesting about the question of Nazi looted art is that that is something that is an exception to that. And this is something called Military Government Law number 59, which is one of the laws and rules that were used to administer Germany in the absence of a functioning government when the war was over. And as you'll see, there's a lot of language here, and I apologize for that. But essentially what this does is it says, the Allies determined the need to return property to their former owners, even if someone else in the meantime had taken it without any knowledge of it being stolen. And that this presumption that I talked about in terms of who has to prove what is flipped. So if we're talking about a group of people that was persecuted in the relevant period, in the relevant place, so Germany after 1933, France after June of 1940, etc., then the assumption is that the transaction was invalid. And the other thing that this is addressing, which I'm sure will be familiar to those who listened to Elizabeth last week, is so much of what we refer to as Nazi looted art were in fact what we call forced sales. The Nazis had a peculiar penchant, I'll say, for cloaking these things as transactions rather than outright thefts. And that can be hard to unwind in retrospect. And so what this law does, what this sort of sets as an important principle going forward, is that if you're, as a rule of thumb, whether it's a provenance researcher or a lawyer or anything else, you look for this sort of triangulation of who was the person, were they persecuted, were the Nazis in control of that territory at the time. Zooming very far forward, criminal event of 1998, the Washington Conference on Holocaust Era Assets, which was not specifically about art, are the Washington Conference Principles on Nazi Confiscated Art. Again, note the terminology. The sort of conception of the framers of the Washington Principles didn't really get too far into what's confiscated versus forced sales versus flight goods and things like that. And these things really continue to evolve and continue to be at the core of a lot of disputes that I deal with and that others wrestle with. But the Washington Principles do a very important thing. They're not a treaty, they're not a law, but they set a sort of aspirational principle of achieving fair and just solutions, even if strictly legal ones are not available. And this has had a very profound effect. I mean, I think there's no getting around it. And people disagree sharply on how effective or useful the Washington Principles are today. But I am someone who thinks it's really important not to forget that before the mid 90s and leading to this moment in the late 90s, these concepts were not really generally accepted or part of provenance research, the general commercial market, sort of what was considered acceptable title in the absence of these concerns. And it set a real flag in the ground of the importance of the issue and the importance to look beyond merely literal technical ability to retain the property. Because like I said, there are a lot of such defenses available to folks in disputes. Around the same time, actually slightly before, the Association of Art Museum Directors issued the report of its task force on the spoliation of art during the Nazi World War II era. This was something that had a big effect on me, like I said, because this was the directive that caused my director to send me down into the basement of the museum I worked in to examine these records. And this was a time, quite in contrast to what Renée was saying about what's really exciting about what's available now, where it was a lot of stacks of paper and index cards and things like that. And that was a big treat for me, but that's just my personality. But again, this sets up the ethical versus legal discussion. These are a set of guidelines for American museums. The AAMD is, as most of you will be familiar, is very influential, but it does not actually include the membership of most museums in the United States, and it is only art museums. But nonetheless, it's a really important statement of policy. And I am someone who has said that I think these principles have aged really well because they are, I think, intended to be nuanced. They are targeted towards transparency and fairness. And of course, in the execution, there has been a lot of disagreement about how these principles and guidelines have been followed or not. So within the United States court system, as these things, particularly in the 90s, spurred by a lot of the events I've talked about, raised awareness of this, people started to come to disagree about what ought to happen to particular objects. And this is where in sort of what I call the first era of restitution litigation, most of these cases focused on whether the passage of time could be excused to bringing a claim, because in most states of the United States, property claims like the ones we're talking about, you know, if Elizabeth accuses me of stealing her car, that's going to be subject to a 3-year statute of limitations, which is pretty short, and that can be extended if certain things were unknowable. And so a lot of these cases turned on how much could be known or not. This is a case involving the Norton Simon Museum, which is so complicated I can't get into the facts and get to anything else tonight, but it raised the specter of the statute of limitations in the first instance because California had tried to amend its limitations period to abolish it for Holocaust claims, and that was not permitted by the federal courts, and California then enacted a sort of longer neutral statute of limitations, which allowed the claim to proceed. And it ultimately resolved in the museum's favor for reasons to do with the sequence of this painting, which was owned by Jacques Houtstikker in Amsterdam, but had previously been owned or not, it's still a little bit disputed, by a man named George Servikov Stroganov, who claimed that it had been taken from him by the Soviets. And after the war, the Dutch government gave it back to him rather than the Houtstikker family. And the federal court ruled that that decision in the 60s to give it back to Stroganov was what we call an act of state. But this was one of the cases that raised the ability of states to enact statutes of limitations, and states were frustrated in their ability to do so. This is a painting that is in the Detroit Institute of Arts that belonged to the woman named Martha Nathan, who fled Germany. This raised questions not only about the statute of limitations, which were resolved in Detroit's favor because Michigan doesn't allow the limitations period laid for any reason, you know, equitable or otherwise. This is also a case that raises questions about sort of the nature of confiscation. Is leaving something in extremis the same as someone forcing you to sell it, the same as someone taking it? These are a lot of unresolved questions in litigation. This is a case that happened here in Boston, where I live, involving the Museum of Fine Arts. And again, in the tension between the ethical and the legal, I cite this very frequently as an example where I think the museum deserves credit, because the claimant made a demand on the museum, didn't file a lawsuit for more than 3 years. So whatever one wanted to say about the 60 years, 70 years in between, there was no question that she knew of the claim more than 3 years ago. And the museum was you know, almost certainly to prevail, and nothing is certain, but the museum went to a lot of time and trouble to demonstrate in its filings why it believed it was not, in fact, a forced sale or eluded work of art. It didn't have to do that. It could have won the case with the same legal argument without doing that. And so that's, you know, like I said, something where you see the overlap, not just of the legal, but with the ethical. This has all changed because of a 2016 law called the Holocaust Expropriated Art Recovery Act, which reset the statute of limitations for all Nazi looted art claims at 6 years from 2016, subject to a couple exceptions. And it made that a national standard. So it solved the problem that California had, that the federal courts had deemed this was something sort of that implicated American foreign policy, which is preempted by the Constitution. And that has sort of moved these debates to some extent past merely has too much time passed, and in most cases the answer was yes, and the claims were dismissed. So that was obviously a very significant development. One example I like to cite is this painting, which was owned by Elizabeth Taylor, the actress, and when she went to sell it in, I think it was 2004 originally, the heirs of the woman who had owned it sued her, and she won. Elizabeth Taylor won because the court ruled that the heirs were essentially on constructive notice, that the world at large knew that she owned this painting, or that it was in the United States, because it had been offered for sale at Sotheby's in 1990, I think, even though it didn't sell. This painting was sold at Christie's again in 2019, and there was no dispute because that lawsuit settled the title claim. I cite this because I do think, I wonder, as the cases have evolved, an understanding of sort of what it means to know what's out there, whether that would come out the same way today, that a exhibition catalog, which someone may or may not have actually read, you know, is enough to put someone on notice. But that was the result. So the other big category of disputes, including the one that I'm involved in, is about objects that are not actually in the United States, where there is some party or plaintiff that usually is an American, but the painting is in a foreign state museum. So the best known example of these is the painting here, Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer by Gustav Klimt, that was owned by Maria Altman's uncle when it was taken from her, and she sued under what we call the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which allows you to sue foreign sovereign nations and their agencies and instrumentalities. And the way it allows you to do that is when the claims concern rights in property taken in violation of international law. Now, I've just spent a great deal of time in hot air at the Supreme Court talking about what that means, but in most of these cases, it was applied in sort of a straightforward way. And this case was allowed to proceed. This case also went to the Supreme Court, not on the question of whether it was a stolen painting, but on whether the law could be applied to events that preceded the passage of the law in 1976. And this case then went to arbitration, and Mrs. Altman won this painting and several others back from the Republic of Austria. This is another case brought against the Kingdom of Spain and the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection. Using the FSIA, again, that's a state-run museum, and the argument was that when Lily Cassirer sold this painting in 1938 or 1939, that was a taking in violation of international law, and that the law was implicated. The museum has since prevailed again on other grounds, on the grounds that applying Spanish law, that it was on display long enough that a claimant could have made a claim, and then when that period passed, Spain acquired title. These cases involved years of very complicated legal civil procedure, as well as the substantive law of sort of what's a taking that I was talking about. And this is no exception. The last one I'll talk about is my case. These are a collection known as the Welfenschatz. This is currently in the Kunstgewerbemuseum in Berlin, which is run by the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz, the SBK, or the Heritage Foundation. This collection of about 82 works of medieval reliquary devotional art was bought by several art dealers in 1929 from the aristocratic family that owned it until then. When the Nazis took power, and they sold 40 of them to Cleveland, where they still are and that are not the subject of any dispute. When the Nazis took power, not surprisingly, things changed. This is a letter from the mayor of Frankfurt, where these men lived, to the Chancellor of Germany, who at the time was Adolf Hitler, in which he's talking about how to get the collection back, as he puts it. And as you won't be surprised to think, these are really sort of foundational works to the concept of German identity, and for nationalist zealots like the Nazis, the idea that Jewish art dealers might own these really perturbed them. What follows is a long and sort of hard to summarize exchange, but essentially a group of pretty serious Nazis, ultimately at the direction of Hermann Goering, organize a transaction at which these things are purchased, in our estimation and our evidence, we think, shows, at a dramatically reduced price such that it can't be considered a fair sale. Our case focused on a couple questions as it went up to the Supreme Court. We argued that the taking of art by the Nazis was an international crime by any reasonable definition of the word, but if nothing else, genocide violates international law, and so therefore the statute would be satisfied. The district court agreed with us. The DC Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with us. Here are the sort of relevant quotes that expropriating the property. And that's because the Genocide Convention talks about the taking of property for the purpose of eliminating a group's ability to exist. And that is what the Nazis did from the very beginning. They took aim first at Jews' ability to exist within society. And so that, doing that, and they were particularly focused on art, no less, but doing that constituted genocide. The district court agreed with us. The Court of Appeals in 2018 agreed with us. The Supreme Court did not. This is a letter from several Congress people as the case went up to the Supreme Court, because one of the things we had a real problem with was that in arguing that this wasn't genocide, Germany made some, I would say, novel arguments about when the Holocaust could be considered to have begun, I think is the politest way I can put it. And that bothered me a lot. It bothered a lot of people in Congress a lot. It bothered a lot of people around the world a lot. And this was a letter that they wrote to the German ambassador asking for some answers that they never got. Supreme Court took the case. We argued it in December. They decided it in early February. And what they said was, no, genocide is not the right focus of the question. The question under the statute concerns a sort of more classical view of expropriations by states of people other than their own nationals. There's a whole different body of law about when a person can complain about his or her treatment by his own government. And what the Supreme Court said was that this statute, the FSIA, is for when the government takes property from someone other than its own nationals. But it didn't dismiss the case, which the SPK had asked it to do. What it did was sent us back to the district court, where we will be, to determine, to address the standard and the question of whether Jews in Germany generally, or these men specifically, were German nationals within the meaning of that analysis, a new rule of law that wasn't the focus of the courts before in our case. And that will be kicking off shortly. That will unfold over the next few weeks or months, really, as far as that briefing is concerned. And I expressed no opinions as to the likely outcome. I'm optimistic. I think we have the better of the law, because fundamentally, I think if you ask who was a German national in 1933 after January 30th, under, I think, prevailing conventions at the time, the question is first put to the government of that country at the time. And if you asked the German government in the summer of 1933 whether Jews were Germans, the answer would have been no. And so that is sort of how we look at it. So that's a lot of what I do in a very short amount of time, and I apologize for speaking so quickly, but I think I will leave it there and look forward to the discussion hereafter.
Okay, well, thank you, Nicholas. That gives us so much food for thought. And for those of you who are interested in this question about definitions of the Holocaust, when did the Holocaust begin? And if you didn't have a chance to see last week's program, that also is an issue that I addressed. And one of the key points that I made in that talk was that dispossession preceded deportation in many cases. And I walk through some of the steps in anti-Semitic persecution that progressively weakened and made the Jewish population more vulnerable. So if you're interested in those issues, you can also see that in that lecture. So many good things for us to come back to. So thank you for that. So now we're going to have the perspective of a gallery owner in Houston. I'm very happy to welcome Gus Kopriva. He's the owner of Redbud Gallery and is also a collector with expertise in German expressionism, French symbolism, and contemporary art. His collection contains some 1,800 items, and he has a very keen sense of the art market with a good deal of experience in the art market. He prefers to describe himself as a gallerist and not a dealer, which is a fascinating distinction that I expect that he will explain for us a bit more. So it'll be very interesting to get this perspective for someone who's so closely involved in the art market. So welcome, Gus.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to talk to you all about this subject. A little background. I grew up as a result of the Nazis' invasion of Poland in '39. My birth was after the war, but I grew up in the rubble. And my German mother and my French father met in Saint-Moi, I was born because of the war. Growing up in that part of Germany, my mother married an American, and we ended up in the United States. My wife, who I met in high school, is an artist, and she was studying art history from a professor named Dr. Peter Gunzer, who was from his family was from Stuttgart. Otto Dix and other expressionists did portraits of his family. He ended up in University of Texas, and then he founded the art history department at the University of Houston. Well, my wife was fortunate to take art history under Dr. Gunther. At the same time, Dr. Gunther was one of the co-authors of the exhibition at the LA County and several other locales of an exhibition about degenerate art. And I, as an engineer, started studying everything that she studied. So I would take all of her books, read, because I had a great interest in European history and its arts. So the degenerate art program that the Nazis used, they also confiscated works. They confiscated works wherever they could. Many citizens, museums, Jewish people, and so on. And they sold many of it for profit at auctions in Switzerland and other places. Hitler himself was a realist painter, and he hated modern art. So after we did an exhibition at the Houston Holocaust Museum with paperwork from that degenerate art show. And then gradually, as I worked through that program, the essentially theft of many pieces of art from many sources in Europe under the Nazis, I began to realize that the Ten Commandments, the cardinal sins from St. Thomas Aquinas, every one of those techniques or sins or whatever you want to call them were utilized by those people in power in the 30s and the mid 40s up to 1945 in Germany. And to this day, I'm a collector, so I have a lot of experience buying art. I'm a curator. I am a gallerist. I buy art and I sell art. And so in these various activities that I'm engaged in on a daily basis, I encounter these terrible instincts that humans have in regard to avarice, greed, money. And it all boils down to that to me. I see scams, fraud, attempted scams every week on the internet. People trying to purchase art with bad checks, bad cashier's checks, fraudulent means, shipping charges that are all scams. I see misrepresentation by dealers. The famous case Nadler, for example, it's on Netflix right now. The oldest gallery in New York, one of the oldest galleries in New York. The director there was selling a couple of new unlisted Rothkos and Motherwells and de Koonings every 2 years for millions of dollars. And that gallery is owned at the end by Hammer's grandson. And there we talk about provenance. The provenance was almost non-existent, but the greed of the collectors, the greed of the gallerists won out. And in the end, in regard to the disposition of the case, there were criminal charges, but every one of the cases, that 9 that were brought, or 8 were not brought to trial, the last one was settled out of the court. No one really took the fall except the dealer that was selling the fraudulent Rothkos out of the trunk of a car. And a major dealer in New York's buying them. But we see this all the time. The scams continue. The art market, the current art market, is opaque. It's not transparent. And most people make the mistake when they buy art for a deal, they ignore what little provenance there is, which usually is fraudulent or non-existent, because they're greedy. They want to get a good deal on a major piece of art. It's I see it happening in dealers. When major New York dealer, I know at least two, because I knew the artists, they essentially appropriate or steal the paintings. The artists are notorious for not keeping accurate records of their works. So if you're with a dealer for 20 years, that dealer during that time will squirrel away a few paintings here and there. And good luck getting that back, because there's no proof. So it's the collectors, the artists are also involved. They, for enough money, there's evidence or there's cases where artists paint the same picture or very similar twice or three times to sell to different clients. So all the players in the art world are, let's say, they are guilty of these terrible practices. So the reason I call myself a gallerist, because I was jokingly telling the panel last night that the only other people that essentially are dealers are they deal in weapons and drugs. So I prefer not to call myself an art dealer, just a gallerist, because my passion is art history, and you know, I make my profits from other means beside art. But it's a murky world out there. And one thing I'd like to leave y'all is, it's a good deal, but if you think it's a good deal, buyer beware, as the old adage says, because it could be not in your favor. There's forgeries out there everywhere you look, and it's just beware. Ask other people's opinion, and whatever you do, try, if you're spending a lot of money, 5, 6 figures, 7 figures, get the provenance, because they can't produce it. It's usually a fake. Thank you, guys. I could go on and on about this.
Okay, well, thank you, Gus. I mean, we appreciate your perspective so much. So I think we'll start our period now where we're going to have a conversation among the panelists, and I see that we have questions coming in through the Q&A feature, and we do encourage you to submit your questions through the Q&A, and we will open it up to the audience questions as well. So, Gus, just following up on some of your points there, I find it so interesting that you prefer not to be even called a dealer, and that you would put art in the same category of commodities as weapons and drugs. And we certainly see that that crime organizations are making money through exactly those three things: art, drugs, and weapons. And so, yeah, and yep, and money laundering. Yes, exactly. So, in your experience as a gallery owner, have you had works of art come in that someone wanted to sell, suspected had been plundered by the Nazis? Or I know that you have a particular interest in German expressionism, and so that was a style that was purged by the Nazis from their museums, and then went out on the art market, and then were dispersed throughout the world. Have you come across works in your experience that you think did have this connection to the Third Reich?
Yeah, I had a gallery in Berlin for a year until we lost our lease to a restaurant. Thank God, because I was losing money. But we discovered my cousin discovered in Southwest Germany, discovered a painting by an expressionist Arnold Topp, T-O-P-P. And it was a painting that was in his bedroom for 10 years. He got it from a friend of his whose mother was put into a rest home, and her son said, hey, he couldn't pay cash for moving help, so he said, take whatever you want. And my cousin, I said, hey, I'll take one of these ugly German expressionist paintings off the wall. Now, she had lived in Switzerland for a while, came back to Germany, and I told my cousin, take it to a respectable auction house in Berlin. He did that. So he'd been sleeping with this painting on the floor by his bed for 10 years. And of course, he was very poor. He was on a state welfare system. So they took it to an auction house, and I depended on them. I was not involved money-wise. I hope they did a provenance on it, because I knew it came from a Gallery Stern in Berlin, 1918. It was an important piece of art. It was not worth millions. It was maybe 200,000 euros, but still was a lot of money for my cousin. And the auction house sold it. But I was never involved in the provenance. And I always thought about how this old lady in southwestern Germany, in a small town, was able to obtain all of these beautiful works of art. Because I asked my cousin what else was in the house, and he says, "Oh, just a bunch of Art Deco stuff and more ugly German express paintings." And so abstract. So I never knew what happened. I asked him what he did with what they did with the paintings, and he threw them in the dumpster. So it's a hell of a story.
Ooh. Wow.
Yeah.
Indeed. Well, as Renee mentioned, we still don't know exactly how many pieces are missing, but a common figure that you hear is perhaps around 100,000. And so there are, all sorts of situations one can imagine of what happened to those paintings, like what you're describing, stashed away, or they destroyed in the war, or they in people's attics, thrown in a trash bin, seen as worthless at the time or since then. So that's very interesting. So Gus's perspective of the scenario seems a bit more pessimistic than what we heard. So Nick, I mean, one of the ideas that you mentioned was, we should really keep in mind how far we've come in the last 20 or so years since the pioneering research of the mid 1990s and the Washington Principles. And then Renee is giving us insight, as a provenance researcher, of how that work gets done to make sure that museums are carrying out their ethical responsibility. So I'm interested, I guess, in each of your perspectives, and I guess we'll first, think about the legacy of Nazi art plunder. To what degree should we feel good about the amount of progress that has been made in ensuring, let's think in terms of members of the art world taking an ethical approach in how they are managing works of art, considering the legacy of Nazi art plunder.
I'll jump in, Nick, unless you had something.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Elizabeth, I think a big hindrance on progress being made on finding works that are looted lies a lot in an institution's willingness to divert funding specifically to provenance research. There's, countless institutions in our country. We don't have federal oversight. We don't have really any sort of formal mandates other than best practice and guidelines that museums, we as researchers follow and museums follow. And until there's more funds directed specifically to this area, it's going to continue to be an underrepresented amount of research that can be conducted to restitute these works or repatriate them. I think just in the years that I've been doing this, I have seen some headway, and I have seen some certainly larger institutions, your blue chip institutions, employ or contract with provenance researchers that are skilled in our area. But then you have issues with third-party dealers, auction houses, and smaller institutions that just either lack the funding or it's not important enough to solicit funds specifically for that area. And so I suspect that there's been very little progress made. A lot of what you see in the media are works that have been discovered or brought to the public eye. They're just a drop in the bucket to what I suspect is still out there nationally and globally.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think, as you said, as I said, you know, I'm an optimistic by nature, and if you compare the state of things to 30 years ago, you know, the progress is really remarkable, I think, and cause for celebration. But I just, my own sake, I don't care for complacency, and it's not good enough. And I think, in my experience, the greater problem continues to lie in Europe simply because of the, I think, disparity in where objects ended up. You have a lot of stubborn cases that pop up in the United States, and things come out of private collections. I'm dealing with a case right now that I won't talk about in detail, but and there have been other cases where something, you know, was bought mid-century at a gallery in Europe or in New York, and then the collectors kept it, and then they donated it when they died, or it came up later, and only then, you know, in the last 20 years did a claim or a dispute about it arise. I think it's a work in progress, but I think the biggest challenge is that it remains a totally ad hoc process that depends on motivated heirs and descendants to drive the conversation for the most part. I mean, you have Renée doing her work. You've got the, Nelson Atkins in Kansas City. You've got the MFA. You've got museums that are devoting real resources to getting to the bottom of this. But I think that's not so common. I could be corrected. And I just think in terms of the big ticket items are what get all the attention, right? And understandably so. But there are so many things that were displaced that are not going to justify sending me to the Supreme Court of the United States and fighting about it for 7 years. It's not going to add up. I mean, this is property after all. And, you know, my frustration from personal experience, you know, like I said, is when you look at the countries in Europe and how they deal with their state collections, because just by way of refresher, of course, so much of what was retrieved after the war was returned. The policy of the monuments men was to return it to its country of origin, but leave it to that country to go the last mile. Well, that led to a lot of very disparate results, and it led to a lot of things just ending up in national collections that really didn't belong there. And a lot of these things are just sitting in plain sight. But if you don't have motivated and, you know, with time claimant / descendant family connected to an understanding of where it is, and they're not all in big museums, they're in lots of, you know, there are lots of wonderful small regional state museums all around Europe. People don't even know it's there, and it's sitting in plain sight. And, you know, Elizabeth, I don't even remember at the conference we were at in Cambridge a few years ago, there was sort of this, like, you know, diplomatic but academic fist fight that broke out about sort of like, well, whose problem is this? Is it our problem, the museums, if we don't get the money? And who should spend the money? And is the money being spent effectively, or is it just a photo op? I mean, I'm someone who, partly because of my own litigation with them, but, you know, has been critical of a lot of the steps the German government has taken, because I see them more as kind of a fig leaf, and I'll look over here, we gave something back, don't ask any more questions, please. There's just no systematic approach, which I suppose isn't super shocking because it's an international problem with different governments with their own political constituencies and the rest.
I agree that there's been progress made, but in the last 30 years, the art market has changed. You've got your major auction houses, Christie's, Sotheby's, Trahan's in other cities, and so on. Riesterbach in Berlin, go on and on. But there's an entire second and third tier of auction houses that they do. Well, I happen to know several of them. They do no provenance research. They'll list, we're not talking about $1 million works here. We're talking $5,000, $20,000, $25,000 piece of work. And they'll list it as a Juan Moreau or Picasso. And even a little research would show you that it's a fake. I mean, there's people in London producing these fakes. So the auction houses, for whatever means, and I think their main drive is making money, like what they try to do. They sell, instead of saying after an artist or in the manner of by an artist, they'll say this is a work by Picasso in the description, and that's totally misleading. And they sell them because people think they're getting a good deal. They're ignorant about it. And talking about museums, here in Texas, I happen to know the forger who forged the last letter from the Alamo by Colonel Travis. I mentioned that last night. It's in private hands, it exists. But he went to several of our largest universities in Texas. And I mentioned the word opaque before. He sold that last letter of the Alamo to several university museums in Texas. And they were all quiet about it. They were opaque. And they received the funds to buy this last letter. They bought it from wealthy donors. And some were on the board of the universities. So it gets very political. There's a lot of pressure put on. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is if you don't have the provenance, and the provenance on this last letter was, it was just unbelievable, but the donor gave them the money and the museum accepted the piece. So it's all of the parties are involved. And I think the sweet spot for a lot of these forgeries are, 200, 300,000, 400,000. You hear about the $1 million ones, but there's so much, let's say, illegal transactions going on with all parties that are not in the millions. So it's a huge market out there. And again, we as collectors and buyers and sellers, we have to be aware. We have to do our job and try to follow our best angels, as they say. But it's every day something else will come up. So watch what you do, watch what you buy. But we are making progress in the laws.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, Gus, that these issues are also affecting libraries, and they affect books, manuscripts, and documents that are being acquired by universities and libraries, other institutions. So you raise a really interesting point there, and questions related to attribution, which can affect documents or works of art, and that issue of attribution is closely related to provenance. And so we've got a combination of factors here with the prestige of holding a certain item, whether it's a document or a work of art. There's the cost of provenance research, which is a huge obstacle. And there is often not a will among museum leadership, boards, to invest the resources necessary. And this is going to, we talked about this a bit last week, but this is going to be an ongoing pressing issue with the pandemic and the decrease in museum revenue because of closures. And we see cuts in staffing. And so I've in my own work, I'm trying to be one of the voices to say, provenance research must be maintained as one of the essential services of the museum to make sure that they're maintaining standards of ethical stewardship, but it is going to be a challenge. And so that's one of the points that I would reiterate for those of us who are art lovers and fans of museums. We love our museums, and we can help ensure that provenance research remains a priority because it requires such an investment. And if you have the ability to support museums, consider supporting provenance research, because it is a core aspect of maintaining ethical stewardship. That is, and you see the type of work that Renée does. You know, it's very time consuming, laborious, and expensive. So that's an obstacle, in addition to the factors of the prestige of holding a certain work. And it can be a real sense of, you know, accomplishment, expanding a collection to have a certain item enter a collection. It can, in my work as a historian, I see all sorts of documents about filling gaps and that curators are very excited to fill gaps with works that had come from Nazi plunder. And so, you know, we've got all these different factors swirling around together. Yeah, I had another follow-up question for Nick. You know, so some of the headlines that came out of that recent U.S. Supreme Court decision, I mean, some of the headlines said that this was a major setback for the claimants. I think many people could miss the fact that that case has been remanded to district court, and the question of citizenship will be addressed of the Jewish dealers who sold the items. We had a question come in the Q&A whether Jews had citizenship through 1938, but it was the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship in 1935. I wonder if you can comment on the degree to which that Supreme Court decision should be seen as a setback for other cases, and what you think the implications are for other claims going forward.
So look, there's no question it's a setback, because if you take a step back, the court was completely uninterested in the implications of genocide as a violation of international law of property, right? The court, in its various sort of classic Roberts way, says, no, this isn't that kind of case. We're worried about property. Well, genocide is about property. So you'll forgive my peek about that, but and so that's part of it. You know, the flip side of that is, even in the narrowest conception of what the court framed as a violation of international law, the taking of property from someone else's nationals, right? That what we call, which is now the rule, the domestic takings rule, that the taking by government of the property of its own nationals doesn't defend international law. Well, the Nazis still did plenty of what would clearly qualify under that rule. And if you look at a lot of the cases that have come out of this, they're sort of mixed, right? So Maria Altman's uncle was a Czech citizen who had fled to Switzerland when those paintings were stolen. So under this framing of the law, the case would still proceed. The Kassira case is a little less clear. Now, the citizenship question, you know, will be an issue in our case, and I don't want to delve into it too deeply. But nationality and citizenship are not the same thing. And what the Nazis did with citizenship is even sort of more complicated than that, because the Nuremberg laws didn't actually strip Jews of citizenship. The Nuremberg laws gave Aryans Reich citizenship. So it elevated a group that had not previously been identified before. And the Nazis also went to the sort of gratuitous extra step of publicly declaring the non-citizenship of Jews, often who had already left the country. Their assets having been deprived, the Reich's flight tax having been paid, etc. And so where these concepts overlap, you know, is going to be front and center when we head back to the district court, no question.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. And we have had a couple questions in the Q&A about if you're able to talk about the timing of the proceedings in district court and when we can be watching for that.
Sure. So the Supreme Court opinion came out on February 3rd. The Supreme Court judgment, which is the sort of formal declaration sending it back down, or if it in some cases ending the case, came out last week. That sends the case back down to the Court of Appeals. Actually, just today, the Court of Appeals sent it back to the district court officially, and the parties have agreed to a joint briefing schedule about addressing these questions. So they're going to happen a couple steps over the next few months. We are going to move for what's called leave to amend the complaint to address the new standard of law. I presume the SBK will oppose it. We'll fight about that. And then whatever the complaint is, we'll argue about whether it addresses and survives this domestic taking standard. So that will unfold over the next probably 3 or 4 months. And then it'll be before the district court judge, and she can take however long she wants. I mean, the original motion to dismiss, which was filed in 2016, once it was fully briefed, she had it under advisement for about 9 months, I think. And there were more arguments in that motion than there will be in this one, I think, but we'll see. So it'll still be a little while yet, even if it goes completely south for us as quickly as possible. It'll be a little while, which we have to want.
And another question that we've had in the Q&A is folks asking, what is the best way to keep track of developments in the case? Perhaps following your blog?
That's one way. I don't post about everything that happens in the case. So the case is in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Federal court dockets are publicly accessible online, but you need to log in, and they are not free to read. Regrettably, that's the subject of a lot of other debate in federal court practice. But certainly, major developments tend to pop up on my blog, and I expect in this one, whatever happens with the district court's decision, it'll probably get a fair amount of coverage when that happens.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to be incorporating additional questions from our Q&A from the audience. We're getting quite a few of them, and we will try to address as many as we can. We're getting a couple questions that are more related to the nuts and bolts of Renée's work. We have a question coming in wondering about the databases that you use in your research. I think that's a fascinating element, so that, when we talk about new research coming out in the mid to late 90s, the Washington Principles in 1998, and the advent of the internet. And that changes absolutely the landscape for research. And I talked last week about the digitization of resources. We have a question coming in for Renée. What are the databases that you use? And the person asking this question is particularly interested in records of German and French dealers.
So we have been very lucky in that the National Archives has digitized all of the Holocaust era asset records. Those are accessible through Fold 3, which is the military arm of Ancestry. And that's where all of the Monuments Men records, the MFAA, Department of the Interior records lie. And that's a really great place to start. But as far as dealer records, the Getty Research Institute has put a lot of time and money into digitizing a wealth of information, especially as far as dealer records, stock books, exhibition catalogs. French exhibition catalogs are a huge area that I refer to. The Frick in New York, their library has been digitized, which is another huge help. And then of course, international, the Jeu de Paume website or databases is sort of a first pass. I run a lot of work through that to make sure it hasn't been flagged through there. And of course, the German and Dutch Governments have also launched some very helpful websites with a lot of stock books and records, and just a lot of really helpful primary source material through those areas. And of course, the V&A has the records, the two degenerate art that contain some of the degenerate art records in there. They have those books digitized as well. So there's countless databases that I use, but those are some of the more robust ones that have a pretty good array of sources digitized. Short of traveling internationally and accessing archival material, or even locally, nationally, that's our best resource right now. As far as accessing information digitized is our best resource right now. Mm-hmm. So I can't imagine, Nick, what you went through. I find it challenging, even with all of the wonderful information that's available to me just on my screen. I can't imagine, before the onset of the internet.
it was just a brief moment in time for me, but yeah, it was just sort of very old-fashioned. There were reports of the MFAA and other things like that, and the World Jewish Congress had started putting together lists of targeted collectors and collections, but yeah, it was not a digitized process.
So we have a related question that is addressed particularly to Renee and Gus. This is coming from Amelia Kleiman. So what do you do when the provenance research indicates a red flag? When a work of art, it does appear that it may have a questionable past. What do you do then?
Yeah, as a dealer, I have to be careful there, because if I say that it's a fake, I would be potentially liable if it's not, especially since I didn't do the research. So I usually lateral that decision about that particular piece of art to somebody else. Another expert at the museum, somebody on the catalog Renée board, for example. We had the caveat that we had to go to Rice and talk to a member of the board that certifies the genuine works by Bacavia. So, but I usually do not get involved directly giving an opinion whether it's a fake or not. I'll come go somewhere else. But I will not, if I think it's a fake, I will not get involved. And I'll even tell them that, but I won't put it in writing. I'll say it's my opinion only, and that's it.
So it sounds like the questionable works of art you're dealing with are more forgeries.
Yes. Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
That's your main challenge. Okay, which is connected to all these issues of provenance as well. Okay, so, and Renee, and and it doesn't have to be any particular institution, but then what does one do? So a researcher is working at a museum, and
fortunately, my role is to just present my findings. It's not to make the call on what the next steps are. So I sort of provide that objective, here's what I can tell you, here's the story I've been able to piece together, and it's really up to the institution or the owner to do with what they feel is the right thing to do. And that's where you get into the ethical, obviously the ethical piece of it, because you do have institutions that will take your recommendation and say, this needs to be investigated further. Let's, start retaining legal counsel. Let's talk to the board. But then you have institutions, none that I fortunately have encountered, but I do know that there's institutions that have been presented with serious gaps in ownership. And because of either the work itself or the artist, they will choose to keep it in their collection and not take further action unless a claimant comes forward, which is unfortunate.
Yes, it's pretty rare for museums to carry out this provenance research, determine that it has an illicit past, and then to initiate some kind of settlement. This does happen occasionally. We've seen MFA Boston do this in a few cases. It is very rare. So as I mentioned last week, the system has always relied on claims coming forward to museums. I mean, that is the standard procedure that has been in place since the end of the war. Some institutions are taking that research and then tracing the item to an heir or a rightful owner. This is also what is now, I mean, this just recently has been happening in Europe. In France, for example, I talked about the custodian setup after World War II of works that were not claimed. That research has just begun just within the last several years with the assistance of genealogists. Since we are getting so far removed from the generation of the owners whose works were plundered, now the French government is working with genealogists to figure out who that rightful heir would be. So there are instances of that happening, but that certainly is not the norm, and definitely is not the norm in U.S. museums where we have mostly private institutions.
No, and just this morning there was an article in the Times, in the New York Times, about a Klimt being returned by the Musée d'Orsay, using essentially that same pathway. They identified a claimant, and records came up, and they were proactive in returning it. I think there was involvement on both sides, but I, certainly applaud the actions of the institution for moving forward without having to put the claimant under further duress through a long drawn out, court case. And that's really the best outcome, is to have these issues mediated. And Nick, I certainly don't want to take away from your livelihood, but but if those identified works can be returned fairly swiftly, I think you're eliminating a really large portion of hardship on a lot of heirs. And I think that goes back to the ethics of, museums do have an ethical standard and a code that should be implemented throughout all institutions, I think.
Yeah, and that topic is one that scholars have been discussing in terms of alternative dispute resolution and alternatives to litigation. Again, not to take away business from Nicholas, but what are the other mechanisms that are possible outside of litigation, because the path of litigation puts restitution claims outside the ability for many individuals and families.
Look, I mean, I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because most of the cases that I have studied or have been involved in that end up in litigation were the subject of some level of discussions before they ended up in court. And for whatever reason, the parties couldn't come to see things in the same way, or enough of the same way to strike a compromise. But they often do. And I think it's important to say that as compared to the higher profile cases that are in court, it's many multiples of that have been worked out in some way that the parties could live with. And the panels in the countries in Europe that have tried to do this have, to various extents, depending on who you ask, you know, handled these claims in a way that in most cases kept people from going to court. And those panels themselves have had their own twists and turns over time. And I think, you know, I think that other than I think the UK panel, there isn't any one of them that has had an unbroken line of success, and some have stumbled more than others.
And Nick, one question coming in from Pierre Seric, also an attorney. I was wondering if you have any knowledge of deaccession rules in place in Europe being used as a defense to restitution.
So it's an issue, and at least in a couple cases, the panels that exist in Europe were created in part because it was not possible to restitute works from state collections because it is against the law there. There's no sort of should we or shouldn't we debate in European state museums. They are forbidden from deaccessioning objects ever. And so these panels were created, like I said, and gave the legal authority to the museums to give something back if someone, whether it was the panel or the museum, decided that they ought to. But there are only 5 of them. You know, so the Orsay News Today was really exciting, which is just a beautiful painting too. I love that painting. I don't go in for Klimt's shiny stuff as much, but the trees I really like. But it's France, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Austria, and Germany. That's it. And so it's a real struggle elsewhere. I mean, you know, Hungary and Poland are particularly hostile to the topic of restitution. So it doesn't really matter what the deaccessioning rules are; they're not interested anyways. But it's a good question, and the answer is, I think, in a lot of places, it's yet another obstacle.
Yes. Okay. We have an excellent question from one of my former students who graduated from the University of Denver last year. I worked with him on an honors thesis. Matthew Greenlee has a more philosophical question, and that is, what is at stake for all of us, Americans, Europeans, if we fail to try to reckon with the injustices committed by the Nazis, with this particular type of injustice against the art world? What's at stake if we fail to be a part of that, of reckoning with that past? So you'd like to dive in on that?
I'll take that one. I think a lot's at stake, and this is, you know, I say this with the benefit of my recent experience. I'm very proud as an American of the leadership that the United States of America has shown on the question of Nazi looted art since 1943. I think that's a really wonderful thing that the United States should be very proud of, and is not alone. But I think it is one of those few things that we can all agree is a good thing. And I think we are at a point, and I don't think this year's opinion in my case helped much, where we are reminded that is not inevitable, and that takes the effort of people in the present day to continue it. You know, one of the passing notes in the opinion about how to interpret sovereign immunity is an argument that the Trump administration advocated in our case, which was, well, this would be a bad thing, because if we interpreted sovereign immunity this way, then maybe Germany would pass a law that would create liability for slavery in the United States. And I look at that, and first of all, I think that's it's incorrect, and it was a really it was unfortunate that the State Department and the Justice Department chose to make that argument. But my other response to that as a citizen is, well, if we don't do the right thing, then maybe we deserve it, right? If we're not going to stand up and say, this is what is right and this is what was wrong, then, well, who are we to complain? And, you know, sometimes the right thing is hard to do, but it's usually not hard to tell what the right thing is. And that's how I feel.
I agree. I mean, there's those of us out here boots on the ground, doing the deep digging and the hard research. We're in this not for the money, we're in it for an obligation to provide, to be a public servant, to serve as a gatekeeper for not only our culture, but cultures globally. And if you're not coming in this with a pure heart and a moral compass, then you're probably in it for the wrong reasons, because you really are doing this to right a wrong that was long before our time, but it's the most we can do to make up, I think, to make up for, atrocities that happened long before I came along. But it's the least I can do for these families that were wronged in this way.
Gus, do you have any final thoughts related to that question?
Yeah, I'm torn. I'm a German and I'm also an American. And I had one of my German friends, he's a doctor in Heidelberg, and we were talking about looted art. We were talking about the Soviets and the Nazis, all of the looting that went on during the war. And then he asked me, as I was walking out, we had a pretty good discussion. He says, well, how'd that case in Texas end up? I said, and we were 40 miles away from Quedlinburg. And this was a case where an American Army captain stole some artifacts from a cave or somewhere where they hid it during the war, from around Otto the First, 1000 AD or whenever it was. And he kept those artifacts in a small town in North Texas for many years. And of course, those objects finally came to light when he tried to sell them. But the end result of that case, you reminded me, was just like the Nodler case in New York, with $80 million worth of forgeries and fraud and larceny, no murders that we know of. The end result of that case was that the German government paid to get that treasure back from the family of the American soldier that stole it. So I'm sitting here and oh my God, and I'd forgotten all about the Quedlinburg case, but here it is, right up the road from where I live. And it's another situation of stolen art. And what it was all about was avarice, greed. We're all human, and we do bad things sometimes. And like we say, we have to constantly be on the watch, do the best we can, educate other people, and get restitution for the people, the families that lost their art, the best we can. But it's a constant battle, guys. And it's going to continue to come up as discoveries are made.
Yeah, I would just add briefly, I know that we're running just a couple minutes over, so we need to wrap up. I would just add very briefly that it really is a form of belated justice for victims, not only of the Nazi regime, but if we think about other areas of art where items have been plundered from various communities, societies, Native Americans, Indigenous peoples, from the peoples of Africa. We can see that colonial repatriation is a very important debate right now. And so that's why our center at DU is really devoted to investigating these ethical issues, not only with regard to Nazi era art, but also other categories of art where communities have suffered in their past from looting, plunder, forced sales. And now it's up to many of us who really believe in social justice to see this kind of research, this work, and when warranted, restitution, repatriation as a form of social justice.
You brought up a good point, which I forgot. I live in Idaho part of the time. As the prices for Native American art increases, you will see more and more cases coming up against museums and private collectors around, let's say, how did you get those, Nate? How did you get those the shoes, the arrows, the clothes? Where'd you get those? How'd you get them? Who'd you get them from? And it's going to be an interesting can of worms when the price point gets so high that the heirs start going after the people that own those objects now or have custody of them.
Okay, I have to be the heavy here. And it's my official role to close us out this evening. And I want to do that with so much appreciation and gratitude to our panelists tonight. And I want to tell you the thing that I've been thinking about as I've been listening tonight, and that is, how do we grow more people like you all? Because as an educator, I always am considering how we're going to fill the roles of people that can come to think with your complexity and your compassion and your level of inquiry into these really complicated human social justice, democratic issues. So I'm going away inspired by that thought and some more thoughts about how we can continue this collaboration. And I hope that all of our participants tonight and all of our audience members tonight are leaving this experience with a stretched brain, because sometimes that's painful, but it's always good to have a stretched brain. So on behalf of Holocaust Museum Houston and on behalf of the University of Denver, thank you all to the panelists, and thank you all to our audience for the great questions and really, really inspiring thoughts. So be safe, be well, keep thinking, and watch for further collaborations, please. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was nice to be with you all.